Welcome to Subscription Prescription, the podcast where you get the information you need to scale your subscription program. Hello and welcome to another dose of Subscription Prescription. This is the podcast where we help you figure out everything related to D2C subscriptions. I'm your host, Matthew Holman, and this week we're going to be talking about the most unsexy of subscription topics, and that is frequency. Now, when I talk about frequency, I'm just really saying how often people should be getting their subscription based off of your product. And on this week's dose, I'm going to be diving into a few different examples from easy all the way up to incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible, so that you can get some insights on how to approach offering frequency in your subscription business. Now, the first one that I want to start out with is when we look at curation or your typical subscription box. This is like you're subscribing to something like Crunch Labs, where every month you're getting something, you're opening it up, your kid's playing with it, putting it together, right? Now, there are actually a few different ways to do curation boxes. It doesn't have to be every single month. It can be every other month. It can be quarterly or even semi-annual or annual, depending on the industry. But the reason why you pick the certain frequency you do is twofold. The first is money, like how often you want to get paid. But the second comes down to consumption, related to how the person is using your product. Ultimately, this is the question for all frequency alignment is consumption, because if you can get your frequency to align with consumption, you've unlocked retention because they're using their product. They're never going to have too much product or just ran out of product and then cancel your subscription. When we're looking at curation, the idea is trying to be careful to not over inundate somebody with your product, right? So if we're talking about, say, a bourbon discovery box or a whiskey discovery box, there are some people that might want a monthly discovery box for that, but based off of the cost to ship, and how much you're giving them, it might make more sense to do something like that every 2 months or every 3 months and treat it into more of like a quarterly splurge or quarterly event. Now, I work with a lot of different educational subscription companies too, where they're doing crafts or kits, learning guides, things like that. And it makes sense to send that on a monthly basis. But what can happen is that sometimes people are not utilizing it or using as much as they're getting, and so they often might pause or skip a subscription. When we're thinking through subscription boxes, that is often what I would say one of the more simple ways to think about frequency. You can always try testing different frequency amounts to see if you can improve retention by getting that to align. However, I would always say that if it's close or even maybe a little bit moving against you, you should default to the more frequent option because that's going to be better for revenue and your margin, cash flow, all the things, right? So if a monthly box means I have even 10% worse retention over time than it does by doing something every other month or quarterly, I'm still going to want to defer to the monthly box because the revenue for that could be 2 to 3 times larger than it would be on a quarterly, right? The other thing when we're thinking about frequency for subscription boxes is, and a trend that I'm seeing going as well, is giving people the option, if it's a product, they can either buy past boxes, or if it's something that you're curating regularly or getting a lot of demand for, offering that as one-time options, either as add-ons to the subscription or something that they can buy just by themselves. Now, that might not seem like maybe like that aligns, Matt, with the topic on frequency, but that actually does give people the buying option to get a little bit more of what they like and use more of what they like. There is also some power, depending on how the box system is set up, where people can change the frequency that they want. Most box systems aren't set up for that. It makes more sense for some of these other different product types that I'm talking about. Now, what I would say is the easiest from a frequency standpoint are subscriptions that have a preset recommended amount that people are taking. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes people will miss it or skip periodically. But when we're thinking about frequency, those are the easiest ones. The things to worry about when you're set up with a frequency like that, it's actually all about making sure you get product adoption right away. Because the longer you wait, the more and more behind somebody's going to be. So for example, if it's a 30-day subscription and somebody doesn't start using the product for 2 weeks, they're going to see a renewal reminder email 10 days later than that, and they're going to have half a month's supply, and you are potentially at risk of losing that subscriber. So when we're thinking about preset cadences, we do want to look at making sure our onboarding process is really clean, it's in depth, it's driving that immediate adoption. We're looking at unboxing experiences to make sure that we're driving immediate adoption. And we actually even might want to do check-ins with like postcards or additional emails inside that first month to make sure that that product is being used. And then making it really simple for somebody to maybe delay by a week or two if they were behind. Or even better yet, a lot of brands I'm seeing are now starting to actually default that, so that if you're on a 30-day renewal, it doesn't renew 30 days from the point of order. It's renewing from a week plus 30 days. So you made your order, there's a day or two for fulfillment, there's 4 or 5 days for shipping, and then you're triggering a 30-day either off of the delivery notification, or you're doing that just manually by setting a time frame for that, so that the renewal cadence aligns with usage, right? That's really, really important. And then if anything happens, that's where your subscription platform comes in to making sure it's easy to pause, skip, cancel, or use as needed. Now, slightly more complicated are things where the consumption is going to vary across user or across use type. So a really good example of this is protein powder. Some people might use a scoop every day. Some people might use 2 scoops every day. Some people might alternate between 1 or 2 scoops or even 3 scoops, depending on their need, how often they're working out, they're using it for meal replacement, that type of thing, right? Or another example might be pet food. Depending on the size of your dog, your dog might be eating more, or maybe there's a little bit of waste with how much when you're pouring it out or other elements. Skincare is another really common one for this. I use Yo Pretty Boy for some moisturizer on my skin. They recommend 3 pumps each time. I have really dry skin. I'm here in Utah. I'm regularly using 4 and sometimes 5 to make sure I get enough coverage and enough saturation for my dry, old, dusty skin, right? So all those consumptions can vary, right? So in this instance, we're not so much concerned with this idea of like making sure that we're triggering the email or the renewal date to happen 7 days after, like I was saying, with the tight alignment. You can do that, but that's not necessarily where I would start or where I would worry about. And additionally, with the onboarding experience, I'm not as concerned with making sure they're using it as a part of their routine immediately, although that is incredibly important to make sure it becomes part of their routine. I want to make sure I'm adding in a little bit of messaging related to how easy it is to adjust the subscription, of how simple it is to make changes, to get it a little bit sooner, to delay it. I want to make sure that's part of the onboarding process in email as well as inside the box. And also for a brand like that, I would think about looking at SMS as well, because a lot of the platform subscription apps are leveraging better SMS strategies where it's easy to manage or delay or skip an order based off of your usage needs, or even getting it faster. And having that in your pocket, like on your phone right away, right there, something that you don't miss, can be really, really important for keeping that subscriber around on a longer time period. The other thing with this is you actually do have an option where people can, depending on the size of your product, you could pre-sell them into more depending on that usage. So for me, like the skincare user, I liked getting more because now I'm not as worried about running out. For pets, pet food can be a little bit difficult because of how big it is, but maybe it makes sense to have a backup bag and you're more like replacing that bag. And this is, again, something we can get into in our messaging and explaining how most people are storing and using their pet food, as well as like protein powder or coffee or these other things. The whole idea is trying to figure out, for creating a system, I should say, where individual subscribers can develop the frequency and habits that works for them so that they're getting what they need over time. So I've mentioned before about being a Dollar Shave Club subscriber. It took me a few months to get on the cadence for the razor renewals that I wanted, for how often I shaved my head and how often I felt like needing to replace those razors. But once I was able to do that through their platform, I was a subscriber for years and years and years. I will say, side note, I'm no longer a subscriber. I think I've talked about in recent episodes about finding a higher quality razor and the importance of keeping a quality product in your subscription. Otherwise, you will lose people over time. A little side note on that. But anything we can do to get frequency aligned for people in this instance is going to be incredibly critical, right? Again, with the first instance I mentioned related to the habit forming piece, it's not as critical. It's more about getting people on the habit and making sure they're sticking with the habit. Those are the critical pieces. On this piece, it is much more about understanding that different people are going to use your product at different rates and making sure that those options are available. There's tons of examples of this. I've mentioned I Heart Dogs in the past. They'll filter the delivery amount based on dog size so that you're selecting the amount that's right for you. Other coffee or drink brands will say like how often, if this is like 1 cup a day, this is 2 cups a day, this is 1 cup a week, that type of thing, so that you're buying the right frequency. Trying to get that up front can be important, but again, then making sure you're educating people, potentially using SMS to make sure that there are these controls there. I will mention as well at this point, at QPilot, we did this research a few years ago across hundreds of subscription brands, pulling all of their data. Unlocking that frequency piece has a massive impact on LTV. So when we're talking about making 3 changes to frequency, that on average has a 200% higher LTV than people that aren't making those changes to their frequency. So letting people find the right frequency is really, really important. Now, the final one is where there's massive variance in usage, right? I've looked at some particular brands around this, and a really good example of this is thinking about like lubricant, sexual lubricant. So if you think about it, not everybody has sex the same amount of times as other people do. That's one. Not everybody uses the same amount of lubricant each time they use sex as other people do. And so the variance between lubricant can be massive. The same thing might be said for like a headache pill, or where I might get a migraine once a month, you might be getting them once a week. Other supplements, depending on like how hard people are training. Like for example, you might see for winter athletes, a spike in usage over your supplement in the months leading up to and during winter, whereas you won't see anything in the summer. You might see the flip of that for summer-based athletes, right? So we can have tons and tons of variance for people like this. And what's frustrating from a subscription perspective is you want people to buy, and you hate when people cancel because they have too much product, but you really need to think through even more than these other examples of how I can make this as simple as possible. If you believe you have a quality product, if you believe that your product is answering the problem for your subscribers, then it is not about locking in revenue, as much revenue as possible. It is about locking in the consumer. And locking in will mean different things for different consumers. And how you lock them in comes down to their ability to easily adjust their order. And that's why I said before, you should look at SMS. If you have wide variety in how people are using your product, you have to be using SMS. You should be letting people know, checking in with them via their phone very quickly. Do you need more product now or not? It's as simple as that. How your subscriber portal looks, how you're onboarding people via email, making sure you're engaging in education as part of the onboarding process with inserts, making sure you're leaning heavily into that, and lean into the fact that it's being used differently by people, right? I would say the final thing when we're talking about frequency, especially with this wide variety of usage that can come up, is that not everybody likes a subscription, right? If in that winter athlete example or in the lubricant example, it might just be that when it gets low, I'm going to go buy another one. Or when winter's rolling around, I want to bulk buy for that season. And I want to bring up something that I've talked about before on other episodes, and that is part of our core central thesis at Subscription Prescription, is that it is not about subscriptions. It's about retention and revenue you get from repeat purchases. Subscriptions are often the best mechanism for that when we're comparing LTV and experiences and automation. But there are times in businesses where it does not make sense to use a subscription because the consumer doesn't want it, or you do feel like you're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. And in those instances, it is important to look at other ways you can engage with people and get those purchases. An example of this are a lot of brands that are selling replenishables. So for example, it could be toothpaste for a toothbrush. It could be a filter for a hot tub. It could be lubricant, like we mentioned before. Sometimes people want to bulk buy. Beauty, this is a big thing as well, where people often want to go buy their skincare quarterly or semi-annually and buy a large amount because the brand is doing a flash sale or a big special and they're waiting for that. So that 10% off you're trying to give them on a subscribe and save offer isn't going to move the needle because they know if they wait, they're going to get 30 or 40% off from a really big sale, right? If you're doing that, or if you know that people are buying like that, it's about starting to segment people into those different audiences. I'm not sure I've talked about this tool before, but this is one where we're seeing increased adoption is Rayleon. Shout out to Nathan Snell and his team, where you're able to start pushing people into different audiences. Where, hey, if they're not interested in a subscription, but they've got a high average order value from that first purchase, we're going to want to make sure we're putting them into bulk campaign options and offers, right? If somebody cancels from a subscription, we want to send them those bulk options when the timing is right to see if they want to keep purchasing more, if they had too much product, right? Or if they don't see the value in a subscription. So that's the scary part. But when we're dealing with wide variance in usage and it's really difficult to align those things to frequency, we do need to look at how we can enable repeat purchases that maybe exist outside of a subscription experience. Okay, so as a recap, when we're thinking through frequency, really the fundamentals come down to trying to lock in the subscriber or realistically lock in the consumer on a cadence that works best for them. And yes, there are a million things you can do to try to get them to use the product more, to consume it more so that they want to purchase it more. That's really not what we talked about a ton in this episode. But realistically, it's about making sure that people know how to make changes. They know how to get the frequency that works for them. You can do that on the product page, you can do that via email, and you can do that in the portal, as well as in inserts and postcards, to make sure that people are locked in on a frequency that works for them. And that's it for this week's dose. Stay tuned next week for another episode of Subscription Prescription. That's it for today. Thank you for tuning in. Please subscribe so that you can get notified when new episodes come out each week on Tuesdays.